And it occurred to me that I haven't seen yet a video about this cover. I'm just going to kind of give you a bit of background as to how the cover came to be, where exactly it was taken, and then I'm going to discuss the different ways in which this photograph has become culturally significant. So let's make a start. So obviously the photograph is taken on the zebra crossing outside Abbey Road Studios in northwest London, and the idea for the shoot really came about through laziness. The original idea for the cover was, or for the album in fact, it was going to be called Everest, and it was going to be maybe a picture of either a shot of Mount Everest or a photograph of a packet of cigarettes or something, because there was a brand of cigarettes called Everest. In the end they kind of batted various ideas around, and then somebody had the idea, why don't we just go outside, walk across the zebra crossing, and somebody can take our photo, and that's what happened. So let me explain to you exactly where this photograph was taken. So I'm going to show you a map, and we'll have a look. Abbey Road is a fairly major road in the borough of Camden and the city of Westminster in London. It's basically, if you go east from Regent's Park, which is a really big, huge park in London, then you'll hit Abbey Road. It's just to the north of the Lord's Cricket Ground, and the road runs northwest to the southeast through an area called St John's Wood, which is the area where Paul McCartney has a house as well. And it is a very busy area of London. I mean, people who go to Abbey Road often say this, and I discovered this years ago. The first time I went to Abbey Road was when I was about maybe 17 or 18, and I just couldn't believe how busy it was. The picture would have you believe it was in a kind of leafy suburb somewhere, and you can see all these trees here. It looks quite quiet, maybe a residential street, but in fact if you go there today, it is actually an incredibly busy main road, and it would have been very busy back in those days as well. Probably not as busy as it is today, but the Beatles did have to hold up the traffic while they did the shoot, but more of that in a moment. So the photograph was taken outside Abbey Road Studios. All four Beatles gathered on the morning of Friday, the 8th of August 1969. The photographer was Ian McMillan, who was a freelance photographer, but he was a friend of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, so he was a kind of just an easy point of contact. The camera he used was a Hasselblad with a 50mm wide-angle lens, and I'm no expert in photography, so that was the camera. Now, just prior to the shoot, Paul McCartney had sketched some ideas for the cover, to which Macmillan added a few more details. So let's have a look at that. The Beatles gathered outside the studios on that morning, and here is a photograph of the zebra crossing shortly before they crossed it. And as the group waited outside the studio for the shoot to begin, Linda McCartney took some extra photographs, and they're quite nice because they show the Beatles obviously having a fairly good time. They look quite friendly. This is something which has always interested me. This is supposedly in the absolute final meltdown period where they were kind of hardly talking to each other. There was the whole Alan Klein thing going on between Paul and the others, and yet if you look at the photographs, they actually look quite matey. Okay, so a policeman held up the traffic as Macmillan, the photographer, he got a step ladder and he positioned it in the middle of the road, and he took 6 shots as the band walked back and two across the zebra crossing one way and then back the other way. They crossed the road a number of times while he photographed them, and as we all know, it was a hot day, so Paul actually took off his shoes. He was wearing sandals because he just walked across from the studio from his house, which was only a few streets away, and Paul went barefoot for the shoot. Macmillan also took a photograph for the rear cover of a nearby tiled street sign, but that sign has subsequently been replaced, but the actual crossing is still there, which is quite amazing when you think about it. I heard a rumour a few years ago that they were talking about getting rid of the Abbey Road zebra crossing, and it didn't happen, but it almost strikes me that it should almost be a protected zone, really, you know, because obviously that picture has become such a worldwide famous image, but ultimately it is just a working pedestrian crossing in the heart of London. And if you go there today, you'll see lots of people crossing it and having the photographs taken, you know, lots of Chinese people, lots of Chinese and Japanese tourists go there, and you see flashbulbs going off. You know, it's clearly a place of pilgrimage for Beatles fans. Just going back to the cultural relevance of this cover, I mean, there are so many things to say. The first thing that I'd like to mention really is just the sheer simplicity and the elegance of the cover. And this was something which the Beatles always did. You know, they tended to try and avoid some of the worst excesses of, you know, album covers of the day, apart from Sgt. Pepper, obviously. But it's such a simple image, you know, it's not contrived, it doesn't really make any attempt to be you know, eye-catching or original or interesting. It's just a very candid shot of four guys walking across a zebra crossing. So that's the first thing to say about it. It's you know, it's the kind of snap which you can imagine if it wasn't the Beatles in the shot, you probably wouldn't even look twice at it. I mean, you know, it's a good photograph technically, but as album covers go, you know, it's not Revolver, it's not Sgt. Pepper. There's not a kind of high design there. It's just a very elegant, simple shot. What I do like about the cover is that it's a posed cover, and yet it's a action shot. You know, and those kind of photographs are quite hard to pull off, because obviously, you know, if people are walking, you have to take the photograph at the exact right moment, otherwise the people in the shot look a little bit kind of, you know, out of sync. And the reason they finally chose this shot is that the Beatles' legs all seem to be doing the same thing at once, and, you know, their arms are all down. Paul has a cigarette there, which is a nice little touch. And if you look at the other versions of the photograph which exist, you can probably see that they chose the best one. So it's an action shot, but at the same time it is a posed shot. And the Beatles knew they were having the photographs taken, but there's no elements of self-consciousness there. They're not gurning for the camera, they're not pulling funny faces, they're not trying to do anything out of the ordinary, they are just simply walking across the zebra crossing. And I mean, the symbolism of the cover is, to me, is very powerful. It works in a number of different ways. The Beatles themselves apparently like the idea of the image of them walking across the road, crossing away from the studios and walking away, because they knew at this point that this was their last album. So the symbolism of that is actually, you know, really, really powerful anyway. It's the Beatles walking away from the place where they recorded all the music which had made them famous. But on a deeper level, I suppose you can also say it's the Beatles kind of, you know, arriving at a crucial juncture. You know, they are crossing the road away from one life, crossing to the other side of the street, and then when they get to the other side of the street, they're all going to go their separate ways. You know, that's the kind of symbolism of the cover. You know, Paul's going to go off and do Wings, John's going to go off and do Yoko. That sounds a bit rude, doesn't it? George is going to go off back to, you know, Henley-on-Thames and record All Things Must Pass. So it's the Beatles making a very important crossing. They're at a crossroads, literally, and they are going to go off, and their lives are never going to be the same again. The Beatles are leaving the building, they are disappearing, and I just love the symbolism of that. The other thing that I love about this cover, and which has rightly made it very famous, is the sheer Englishness of it. One of the great things about the Beatles is that they didn't ever really kind of lose their sense of Britishness or Englishness. They never went to America to record like the Stones did, and I think it was Mark Lewison who said that, you know, they stayed at Abbey Road, they stayed an English band, and there was a kind of quirky, homely eccentricity that ran through their work, courtesy of George Martin, who was a very, very English British producer. And the Beatles were quintessentially an English band, they were also a London band. Obviously, you know, they'd risen to fame in the heart of the city, and so much of their influences, you know, through Paul, you know, from the kind of London avant-garde scene. Even though they'd come from Liverpool, they had turned into a London band in a very real sense. And so it's just so great that it's just a classic English picture. You know, the green trees, you have these old buildings here. It just looks like an English street, the British cars and so on. And I love the fact that it's a lovely day. It brings to mind the lyric "Under Blue Suburban Skies," you know, from Penny Lane. And the Beatles' music often conjures up a feeling of summer and you know, fine weather, good times, peace and love and so on. And it's such a peaceful shot. It was quite an achievement to have a shot taken in the heart of a really busy area of London, and yet it just looks like a quiet, leafy suburban street. And coupled with the title of the album, which is Abbey Road, and you know, the word abbey has connotations of you know, monks and spiritual kind of peace, and people who've moved away from the world and are kind of creating their own peaceful space. It taps into spirituality. You know, George was heavily into that at this point. It just works on so many levels for the Beatles. It's very un-rock and roll as well. You know, you can't really imagine the Stones doing a cover like this. And it's also very unassuming, and that's something which the Beatles always did really well. You know, they never... Well, it's not true to say that they didn't let fame go to their head. I mean, they kind of did, but they stayed very rooted. I think that was the thing about them. They sort of tried to stay quite normal, and that kind of plugs in quite nicely to the normality of the shot. It's just another morning, you know, in northwest London, and here are four guys crossing the road. So, one other thing to say, although I don't want to go too deeply into this because I've always found it to be complete BS, but the whole Paul is dead thing, you know, you've got the car here, 28 if, that's how old McCartney would have been had he lived, you know, the grand conspiracy theory that he'd been killed in a road accident and so on. George Harrison apparently is wearing gravedigger's clothes, Ringo is wearing an undertaker's suit and so on. I have no sympathy with any of that, but I must admit it does bring yet another level of iconography to the whole thing, and it's just another reason why the cover is famous and seems to contain lots of different levels of meaning. I think I'm finished. Just one more thing, and that is on May the 22nd, 2012, one of the outtakes from the photography session sold at an auction in London for £16,000. So it's absolutely true to say this album cover is just immensely famous. Everybody knows it. Even people who don't like the Beatles or have got no interest in the Beatles, everybody's seen this cover, and I just think it's one of the all-time great album covers for so many reasons, which is why I'm dead pleased and chuffed to have found this framed photograph, which will now be adorning my office wall.